He was a penniless orphan from a Caribbean rock, a bastard brat who arrived with nothing, yet he built the very system that makes America a superpower today. The genesis of Alexander Hamilton's life is perhaps the most improbable and cinematic beginning of any individual who would eventually help steer the destiny of a global superpower. Born on the windswept, neglected island of Nevis in the British West Indies, Hamilton was the product of what was then considered a scandalous and adulterous union between Rachel Fawcett, a woman of French Huguenot descent fleeing a disastrous and abusive first marriage, and James Hamilton, the drifting, unsuccessful fourth son of a Scottish laird. His birth was marked by the heavy social stigma of illegitimacy, staying that in the rigid hierarchies of the 18th century was often an insurmountable barrier to any form of social, legal, or professional advancement. By the age of 10, his father had vanished, abandoning the family to a precarious existence to avoid the shame of his poverty. Just 2 years later, tragedy struck again when a lethal yellow fever swept through their small home, claiming his mother and leaving the young Alexander orphaned, penniless, and forced to watch his mother's few belongings be seized by her legal family. He was essentially a non-entity in the eyes of the British Empire. Bastard brat, as his future political rivals would later sneer. Yet within this desperate, sweltering poverty lay the seeds of an indomitable and restless intellect. Working as a teenaged clerk for the international merchant firm of Beekman and Kruger, Hamilton managed complex ledgers, mastered the intricacies of global trade, and observed the brutal, high-stakes efficiency of the Atlantic economy. He learned how currency fluctuations in the banks of London directly affected the price of sugar in St. Croix. Gaining a masterclass in global finance and maritime law while still a young boy, however, it was nature itself that provided his improbable escape hatch from the islands. In 1772, a monstrous hurricane leveled the Caribbean, leaving a trail of death, sunken ships, and total destruction. Hamilton's visceral, sophisticated, and deeply theological written account of the storm's devastation, published in a local newspaper, was so profound in its descriptive power that it stunned the island's elite. They saw in him a mind too large for the confines of a Caribbean counting house, and organized a subscription fund to send this prodigy of the Antilles to the North American colonies for a formal education. He arrived in the bustling port of New York not as a conqueror, but as a hungry refugee with nothing but his wits, arriving just as the first sparks of open rebellion were beginning to flicker across the 13 colonies, marking the start of a transformation from an island clerk into the primary architect of an American empire. Upon his arrival in the North American colonies, Hamilton did not merely seek a quiet education. He sought a grand cause that could match the scale of his volcanic ambition. While a student at King's College, now Columbia University in New York City, he found himself thrust into the intellectual and political center of a burgeoning revolution. While many of his older, more established peers were hesitant to act, fearing the overwhelming military and economic might of the British Crown, Hamilton's pen became a weapon of extraordinary precision, speed, and lethality. In 1774, at the age of 19, he published a full vindication of the measures of Congress, a sophisticated legal and philosophical defense of the colonial boycott of British goods. This wasn't the rambling of a hot-headed student. It was a structured, devastatingly logical assault on the very concept of parliamentary supremacy without direct representation. He followed this with The Farmer Refuted, engaging in a high-stakes public pamphlet war against seasoned loyalist writers like Samuel Seabury, who argued that resistance was futile. Hamilton countered with a vision of natural law, arguing that the rights of mankind are not to be rummaged for among old parchments or musty records, but are written as with a sunbeam in the whole volume of human nature by the hand of divinity itself. This period transformed him from a Caribbean outsider into a recognized intellectual force within the patriot movement, proving that he could out-argue the most educated men in the colonies. Understood early on that an empire is not just held together by physical force, but by the narratives people believe about their own liberty, economic self-determination, and national identity. As the debate shifted from the coffeehouse to the battlefield in 1775, Hamilton traded his scholarly robes for a blue uniform, organizing a volunteer artillery company and teaching himself the rigorous science of ballistics, fortification, and military engineering. With the same frantic late-night intensity, he had previously applied to Latin and Greek. He realized that for a man with no family name or inherited wealth to protect him, the chaotic disruption of revolution was not a threat to be feared, but the ultimate meritocratic ladder, a chance to prove his worth through pure courage and superior intellect. He drilled his men with a precision and discipline that drew the attention of high-ranking generals, signaling his transition from a theorist of liberty to a practitioner of modern war. The transition from a captain of artillery to the inner sanctum of the Continental Army was fueled by Hamilton's tireless work ethic and his uncanny ability to synthesize and organize complex information under the extreme pressure of active combat. During the grim, soul-crushing retreats across New Jersey in 1776, Hamilton's courage under fire, specifically his tactical skill in placing cannons to cover the retreating and demoralized American troops, caught the eye of the high command. While other officers were focused solely on their own physical survival, Hamilton was already writing detailed letters and memos on how to improve the Army's chaotic supply chain, administrative structure, and recruitment methods. In early 1777, George Washington, a man burdened by the weight of a failing revolution, a disorganized staff, and a mountain of soul-crushing administrative work, recognized in the young immigrant exactly what he lacked: a brilliant administrative mind, a photographic memory for detail, and a lightning-fast quill. Washington invited Hamilton to join his staff as an aide-de-camp with the rank of lieutenant colonel. For the next 4 grueling years, Hamilton became Washington's indispensable man, effectively serving as a modern-day chief of staff and primary strategist. He was far more than a mere secretary. He was a strategic advisor, a high-level diplomat, a surrogate son to a man who had no biological children of his own. Hamilton drafted the commander-in-chief's most critical correspondence to the stubborn Continental Congress negotiated with temperamental and aristocratic French allies like the Marquis de Lafayette and General Rochambeau, and managed the horrific logistical nightmares of a starving barefoot army during the winters at Valley Forge and Morristown. He lived in the middle of the whirlwind, seeing firsthand the crippling, near-fatal weaknesses of a Continental Congress that lacked the power to tax, enforce national laws, or effectively govern the bickering states. This experience forged Hamilton's political philosophy in the literal fires of military failure. He saw that without a strong centralized executive and a stable unified financial system, the dream of American independence would collapse into a collection of weak, vulnerable microstates preyed upon by the predatory European powers. He was the heartbeat of the American headquarters, a man who possessed the rare and potent combination of a visionary's foresight and a bureaucrat's relentless, obsessive attention to detail. We are dedicated to building a digital archive of human resilience, but these deep dives require immense resources. If you value this level of research, please like and subscribe. It tells the algorithm that deep-form history still matters in a world of fleeting content. Help us keep these legends alive. Despite his prestigious and influential position at Washington's side, Hamilton felt a growing sense of frustration and what he described in his letters as a glory hunger that would not be silenced by administrative success. To Hamilton, real honor and the lasting, immortal fame required to secure a place in history were won on the smoke-filled field of battle, not behind a desk or through the drafting of endless bureaucratic letters. He chafed under Washington's paternal grip, yearning for a combat command that would allow him to prove his physical courage and finally secure his place in the pantheon of revolutionary heroes. He felt that being an aide was a role of servitude rather than true leadership, and he grew increasingly resentful of his desk-bound status. This tension eventually led to a brief, sharp falling out with Washington in early 1781 over a minor perceived slight regarding Hamilton's punctuality on a staircase, which Hamilton used as a strategic opportunity to resign from the staff and demand a field assignment. His persistence, bordering on obsession, and the intervention of influential friends finally paid off in the autumn of 1781 during the siege of Yorktown. Washington granted him the command of an elite battalion of light infantry for a perilous high-stakes mission, the nighttime assault on Redoubt No. 10. This was the moment Hamilton had dreamed of since his days working the docks of Nevis. To ensure total silence, absolute surprise, and to prevent any accidental firing that might alert the British sentries. Hamilton ordered his men to completely unload their muskets and rely solely on the cold steel of their bayonets. Under the cover of pitch-black darkness, Hamilton leaped onto the enemy parapet first, leading his men into the British fortifications in a display of reckless, calculated bravery. The redoubt fell in less than 10 minutes of intense hand-to-hand combat. This victory was the final nail in the coffin of British rule in the North American colonies. And for Hamilton, it was the ultimate personal and professional validation. He had proven he was not just a man of ink, ledgers, and words, but a man of steel, blood, and action. He returned from the war not just as an immigrant who made good, but as a bona fide national war hero, ready to apply the same aggressive bayonet charge energy to the creation of a new, more powerful and unified government. The end of the war did not bring the expected peace or prosperity, but rather a chaotic and dangerous period of near anarchy under the Articles of Confederation. The new nation was drowning in debt it couldn't pay. The states were imposing ruinous tariffs on one another's goods, and the central government was a toothless ghost, unable to even pay the angry veterans who had won the war. Hamilton viewed this fragmentation and the ensuing civil unrest, such as Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, with absolute horror and a sense of impending doom. He became the primary agitator for a new constitutional convention, serving as a delegate from New York and arguing tirelessly for a government with enough energy and central authority to survive. Once the new Constitution was finally drafted in 1787, he faced the monumental uphill task of convincing a deeply skeptical, state-loyal, and fearful public to ratify it. In a feat of intellectual and physical endurance that remains unparalleled in political history, Hamilton conceived of and led the writing of the Federalist Papers. Alongside James Madison and John J. Hamilton, penned 85 essays in a span of just 7 frantic months to explain the new government's mechanics, philosophy, and necessity. Writing under the pseudonym Publius, Hamilton authored a staggering 51 of these essays, often writing 2 or 3 a week, while maintaining a full-time law practice, participating in state politics, and raising a large family. In these pages, he laid out the comprehensive blueprint for a modern, functional nation-state. He argued for the absolute necessity of a strong executive branch, an independent judiciary, and the implied powers of the Constitution that would allow the nation to grow, modernize, and adapt to future global challenges. He countered the deep-seated fears of anti-federalists by explaining that energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government, and that a government without a brain and a spine was merely a recipe for national disaster and foreign intervention. This was a frantic race against time to prevent the United States from dissolving into 13 warring factions before it had truly begun. The Federalist Papers did more than just win the ratification debate in the crucial swing state of New York. They became the definitive commentary on the American Constitution, used by the Supreme Court to this day as a guide and a testament to Hamilton's belief that a nation could be built on reflection and choice rather than the historical norms of accident and force. When George Washington was inaugurated as the first president in 1789, he turned to Hamilton to fill the most difficult, complex, and high-stakes post in his new cabinet, Secretary of the Treasury. The United States was essentially bankrupt, with a credit rating that was non-existent and a mountain of Revolutionary War debt, totaling over $75 million that no one in the government knew how to pay or manage. While others saw a disaster that required debt forgiveness or a complete default, Hamilton saw a golden once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to build a permanent financial foundation for the nation. He understood that a national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing because it would give the wealthy, the influential, and the powerful a vested long-term stake in the survival and prosperity of the federal government. In a series of brilliant, highly technical, and deeply controversial reports to Congress, Hamilton laid out a radical economic vision that would change the course of world history. He proposed that the federal government assume all state debts, effectively binding the state's fiscal interests to the Union. He advocated for the creation of a national bank to stabilize the currency, provide credit for expansion, and manage the nation's complex finances. Most importantly, he envisioned an industrial and commercial future for America. Arguing in his report on manufactures that the country must diversify its economy beyond simple agriculture to become truly independent of European manufacturing and military technology. He was building a financial empire from scratch, establishing the Revenue Cutter Service, the precursor to the Coast Guard, to stop smuggling, creating the first bank of the United States, and founding the Society for Establishing Useful Manufactures in Paterson, New Jersey, to jumpstart American industry. To Hamilton, money and credit were the lifeblood of national power and sovereign independence. He wanted to turn the United States into a global commercial titan, a vision that required a sophisticated, modern understanding of capital markets, credit systems, and industrialization that was decades, if not a full century, ahead of its time. He worked 18-hour days, drafting thousands of pages of regulations, legal structures, and financial reports that still form the skeletal backbone of the American Treasury today. Hamilton's vision did not go unchallenged. Instead, it triggered a titanic, bitter, and highly personal struggle for the soul of the new nation, pitting him against Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in a battle of ideologies. This was the birth of the two-party system, an outcome the founders had deeply hoped to avoid. Jefferson, the aristocratic Virginian and author of the Declaration of Independence, dreamed of an agrarian utopia, a nation of independent, virtuous, and self-sufficient farmers living in a decentralized rural democracy where the state governments held the vast majority of power. He viewed Hamilton's banks, stock markets, and rapidly growing cities as corrupting English influences that would create a new American aristocracy of moneylenders, speculators, and stock jobbers. To Jefferson, Hamilton was a dangerous monarchist and a cryptic Englishman who wanted to recreate the oppressive, centralized British system on American soil. The conflict was deeply personal, visceral, and often descended into nasty anonymous attacks in partisan newspapers. Hamilton viewed Jefferson as a hypocritical dreamer, a man who spoke eloquently of liberty and equality while owning hundreds of enslaved human beings and whose strict construction of the Constitution would leave the federal government paralyzed, broke, and unable to defend itself against foreign threats. The halls of the temporary capital in Philadelphia became a battlefield of competing visions, leaked documents, and proxy wars in the press. Their animosity grew so intense that George Washington, who tried to remain an impartial, fatherly figure above the fray, found himself constantly mediating between his two most brilliant secretaries, often pleading for them to stop their internal dissensions for the sake of the country. This clash defined the American political landscape for centuries, the tension between urban and rural interests, central power and states' rights, and industrial progress and traditional agrarian lifestyles. Hamilton was unapologetic and relentless. He believed the future belonged to the builders, the merchants, the bankers, and the innovators, and he was willing to burn every political and personal bridge to ensure that future was realized. At the very height of his political power and global influence, Hamilton's career was nearly derailed and permanently scarred by a scandal of his own making, the first major sex scandal in American political history. In 1791, while his wife Eliza was visiting family in Albany, he began an affair with a woman named Maria Reynolds. His husband, James Reynolds, eventually discovered the liaison and began blackmailing the Secretary of the Treasury. For over a year, Hamilton paid significant hush money to Reynolds to continue the affair and keep the matter quiet. When political enemies later accused Hamilton of using government funds for these payments, a charge of corruption and embezzlement that would have destroyed his legal legacy and the credibility of the entire Treasury system, Hamilton made a choice that stunned his contemporaries and remains a point of intense psychological study. To protect his honor as a public official and the integrity of the financial system he had worked so hard to build, he decided to sacrifice his personal reputation, his marriage, and his social standing. In 1797, he published the Reynolds pamphlet, a 95-page document in which he admitted to the adultery in excruciating, humiliating, and vivid detail to prove that the money he paid was his own and that he was innocent of any financial misconduct in his official capacity. It was a staggering act of political suicide and extreme personal exposure. While it cleared him of the charge of being a thief or a corrupt official, it devastated his wife Eliza, who was humiliated publicly and made him a pariah in many elite social circles. This episode revealed the core of Hamilton's complex character and obsession with public honor, and his place in history so intense that he would destroy his own family's privacy and peace to ensure that no one could ever question his integrity as the architect of the nation's finances. He believed that his public work was a sacred trust, even if his private life was deeply flawed and human. Despite the fallout from the scandal and his eventual departure from the Treasury, Hamilton remained the primary kingmaker and intellectual leader of the Federalist Party throughout the late 1790s. The election of 1800 brought his political influence to a final, dramatic, and ultimately fatal climax. The election resulted in a deadlocked tie in the Electoral College between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. Because both were members of the opposing Democratic-Republican Party, the decision on who would be the third president fell to the Federalist-controlled House of Representatives. Many Federalists wanted to back Burr, believing he would be easier to control, more transactional, or better to deal with than their arch-enemy Jefferson. Hamilton, however, loathed Jefferson's politics, but truly and deeply feared Aaron Burr's character. He had known Burr for decades in the New York legal and political scene and viewed him as a man without a moral compass, a dangerous opportunist who meant nothing but his own aggrandizement and had no real political convictions or guiding principles. In a stunning and arguably selfless move, Hamilton lobbied his fellow Federalists for weeks to support Jefferson, his longtime ideological nemesis. He famously remarked that while Jefferson has some pretensions to character, Burr has none, and argued that it was better to have a president with wrong principles than one with no principles at all. Hamilton's relentless high-pressure letter writing and lobbying were decisive. Handing the presidency to Jefferson on the 36th ballot and effectively ending Burr's chance at the executive office, this act of choosing the lesser of two evils based on the long-term safety and stability of the Republic was a testament to Hamilton's ultimate loyalty to the nation. But it also set in motion a personal and political grudge that would lead to a fatal conclusion on a New Jersey cliffside 4 years later. The friction between Hamilton and Burr simmered for years, moving from the political arena to the intensely personal. It finally boiled over in 1804 when Burr, then the sitting vice president, but abandoned by Jefferson for a second term, ran for governor of New York in a desperate attempt to salvage his failing political career. Hamilton once again worked tirelessly and successfully to defeat him, allegedly making disparaging and despicable remarks about Burr at a private dinner hosted by Judge John Taylor. When a newspaper published a letter stating that Hamilton had expressed a more despicable opinion of Burr, the vice president, feeling his personal honor was the only thing he had left, demanded a full retraction or a specific explanation. Hamilton, bound by his rigid old-world code of honor and unable to apologize for his genuine, well-documented belief that Burr was unfit for high office, refused to give a satisfactory answer. Burr challenged him to a duel, a satisfaction that was technically illegal in both New York and New Jersey, but still common among the elite. On the misty morning of July 11, 1804, the two men and their seconds crossed the Hudson River to the heights of Weehawken, New Jersey, the same spot where Hamilton's eldest son, Philip, had been killed in a duel defending his father's honor just 3 years earlier. Hamilton, according to his own private letters and a statement of intentions written the night before, intended to throw away his shot, to fire into the air or the ground as a sign of moral superiority and to satisfy the code without committing murder. Whether he missed by accident, fired into the trees, or Burr was simply the faster, more lethal draw remains a subject of intense historical debate. The result, however, was a tragedy for the nation. Burr's bullet struck Hamilton in the abdomen, fracturing a rib, tearing through his liver, and lodging in his spine. Hamilton was carried back to Manhattan, where he died the following day in excruciating pain, surrounded by a devastated Eliza and their 7 surviving children. The man who had survived the crushing poverty of the Caribbean, a catastrophic hurricane, and the front lines of the American Revolution, was brought down by a single lead ball in a field of honor that he himself found barbaric but felt socially and professionally bound to attend. The death of Alexander Hamilton at the age of 47 or 49, his exact birth year remains a mystery, left the young nation in a state of profound shock and widespread mourning. Even his fiercest political enemies like Jefferson and Madison recognized that a giant of the Revolutionary Age had fallen, and that the government had lost its most creative, energetic, and brilliant mind. However, the story of Hamilton's legacy does not end with his burial at Trinity Church in Lower Manhattan. It begins with the tireless and heroic work of his widow, Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton. For the next 50 years, Eliza lived a life of remarkable service, resilience, and fierce devotion that mirrored her husband's own work ethic. She raised their children in near poverty because Hamilton, despite his fame and power, had died with more debts than assets. Yet she co-founded New York's first private orphanage, the Graham Windham, which still exists and serves children today, and served as its director for decades. Most importantly, she became the fierce and unwavering guardian of Alexander's flame. She spent half a century interviewing his contemporaries, collecting and organizing his thousands of sprawling letters, drafts, and reports, and demanding that the United States government recognize his essential, foundational contributions to the founding. She outlived almost every other founding figure, including Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and even Burr, ensuring that when the history books were finally written, Hamilton's role as the chief architect of the American state would not be erased, minimized, or distorted by his many rivals. She lived to see the nation grow into the industrial, unified, and financial power he had predicted during the dark, bankrupt days of the 1780s. Her mission was to make sure the world knew that her husband was more than a man who died in a duel. He was the man who had given the United States its economic spine, its legal framework, and its modern administrative soul. Today, we live in a world that is fundamentally, undeniably, and thoroughly Hamiltonian. Every time we use a standardized national currency, trade on a global stock exchange, or benefit from the regulatory strength and international credit of a central government, we are living within the complex, visionary framework he designed from his desk in Philadelphia and New York. Hamilton's vision of a diversified urban and industrial America has completely eclipsed Jefferson's dream of a stagnant, decentralized agrarian society. He took a collection of bankrupt, disorganized, and bickering colonies and gave them the financial and administrative tools to become a global superpower. His report on public credit and report on a national bank are essentially the DNA of the modern global economy, establishing the principles of public debt, central banking, and capital markets that define the 21st century. Beyond the world of finance, Hamilton's life remains the most powerful and enduring archetype of the American dream, the radical, transformative idea that through sheer brilliance, unrelenting work, and a refusal to throw away one's shot, an outsider from the furthest, most impoverished margins of society can rise to the very top of the world stage. His story is a constant, living reminder that the United States was not just built by landowning aristocrats with settled pedigrees, but by immigrants, orphans, and restless visionaries who saw potential and order where others saw only chaos, decline, and failure. He proved that in a land of liberty, your origins do not have to define your destination, and that a single mind can indeed change the course of history. In recent years, Alexander Hamilton has undergone a stunning, unprecedented, and global cultural resurrection, transforming from a static face on the $10 bill into a global pop culture icon and a symbol of modern American identity. The 2015 Broadway musical Hamilton by Lin-Manuel Miranda, inspired by Ron Chernows' landmark Biography, breathed new life into his story using hip-hop, R&B, and a diverse cast to highlight his status as an immigrant who got the job done through the power of his words. This modern reimagining has brought his complex, flawed, and brilliant character to a new generation of millions, proving that his 18th century struggles with ambition, the heavy cost of legacy, the deep pain of scandal, and the pursuit of a more perfect union are as relevant, urgent, and resonant today as they were in the 1790s. Hamilton's life was a testament to the power of the written word and the capacity of a single, determined individual to shape the very structures and systems of a global society. He remains the most modern and relatable of the Founding Fathers. A man of incredible speed, a man of complex systems, and a man who understood that a nation is not a static monument to the past, but a constant, evolving, and often messy work in progress. He saw that the United States was a grand experiment in self-government that required energy, constant maintenance, and a forward-looking perspective. As we look at the towering skyline of New York City, the bustling floor of the New York Stock Exchange, or the intricate high-stakes halls of the Treasury in Washington, D.C., we see the enduring monumental shadow of the orphan from Nevis, who dared to imagine a future that no one else could see, and had the courage to build it from the ground up against all odds. Reflecting on the sprawling, hyperactive, and often controversial life of Alexander Hamilton, one is struck by the sheer staggering volume of his intellectual output and the white-hot intensity of his personal convictions. From the crowded docks of St. Croix to the blood-stained redoubts of Yorktown and the high-stakes cabinet meetings of the 1790s, his journey was defined by an urgent, almost desperate need to build something permanent and meaningful that would outlast his own precarious and storied life. He was a man of profound and often jarring contradictions, a staunch proponent of law, order, and tradition, who lived a life of revolutionary upheaval and radical change. A genius of national finance and wealth creation who died in significant personal debt, and a champion of the elite and the powerful who began his own life as a desperate social outcast. Yet it is these very contradictions that make him so intensely human, so relatable, and his achievements so remarkably resilient across the centuries. He did not have the luxury of inherited wealth, the comfort of a settled family history, or the safety of a traditional, well-paved path. He had to invent himself through his writing, his intellect, and his actions, just as he had to help invent the complex machinery of the country itself. The institutions he created, the Department of the Treasury, the U.S. Mint, the Coast Guard, and the concept of implied constitutional powers continued to function as the bedrock of American and global governance centuries later. Hamilton understood that for a democracy to survive in a dangerous and competitive world, it needed to be efficient, it needed to be creditworthy, it needed to be industrial, and above all, it needed to be aspirational. His life was a shot that he did not throw away, a frantic, brilliant, sometimes erratic burst of energy that propelled a fragile, new nation toward its ultimate destiny as a leader of the world. In the end, Hamilton's most lasting and significant monument is not made of cold marble or cast bronze in a park, but is found in the very fabric of the American state and the global financial system. A legacy that continues to pulse evolve and inspire every generation that seeks to define what it truly means to be a more perfect union in an ever-changing and complex world.